What if the most famous debate in tennis history was never really about Serena Williams versus Novak Djokovic? What if the real answer to that question was hidden in a completely different match, one that barely looked serious at all? Recently, something happened that forced many people to quietly rethink what they believe they know about professional tennis. A player ranked outside the top 600, who openly admits he doesn't train the way others do, who treats tennis more like entertainment than obsession, stepped onto the court and defeated the world number one in straight sets. And once you understand why that happened, the conversation about men's and women's tennis becomes impossible to ignore. The match that sparked the question. Let's start with the moment that triggered this entire discussion. Nick Kyrgios, officially ranked 671 in the world at the time, played a match against Aryna Sabalenka, the world number one in women's tennis. The result? 6-3, 6-3, no long rallies, no dramatic momentum swings, no physical collapse. Just a calm, controlled win. And what made this result uncomfortable for many people was not the scoreline, it was how normal it looked. Why this result feels so uncomfortable. On paper, this should never happen. Sabalenka represents the absolute peak of women's tennis. She is a full-time professional with elite training, sports science support, nutrition and recovery programs, and constant competition against the best players in the world. Meanwhile, Kyrgios is known for something very different. Publicly, he has said multiple times that he does not train like traditional pros. He skips practice blocks. He prioritizes enjoyment over discipline. He openly admits tennis is not his main passion. By every conventional metric, this matchup should have been a mismatch in the other direction. But it was not. And that forces one uncomfortable question. If a male player this far from peak condition can defeat the best female player in the world, what does that actually say about the gap? This is not about disrespect. Before going any further, this needs to be absolutely clear. This conversation is not about diminishing women's tennis. It is not about disrespecting elite female athletes. And it is not about denying the skill, discipline, or dedication required to reach world number one. Women's tennis is highly competitive, technically advanced, physically demanding, mentally brutal. But acknowledging excellence does not mean ignoring biological reality. That is where this conversation usually breaks down. The core difference people avoid talking about. The difference between men's and women's tennis is not effort, intelligence, or commitment. The difference is the physical ceiling. At the elite level, tennis becomes a game of reaction speed, explosive acceleration, serve velocity, endurance under power, recovery between points. These traits are not evenly distributed between male and female physiology, not because of training, but because of biology. That does not make one category better. It makes them different competitive environments. And when those environments overlap, even briefly, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Why Kyrgios did not need to be at his best. This is the detail most people miss. Nick Kyrgios did not play an extraordinary match. He did not. Serve at 230 kilometers per hour consistently, redline every return, chase every ball, dig into long defensive rallies. He played at maybe 60 to 70% of his maximum, and that was enough. Not because Sabalenka played poorly, but because the baseline speed of the men's game starts where the women's game peaks. That is not opinion. That is observable reality. Power changes everything. 1 extra kilometer per hour on a serve does not sound like much, but at the elite level, it shortens reaction time. It limits return options. It forces defensive positioning. It reduces rally length. Men's tennis operates in a power range where margins disappear faster. That is why even mid-ranked male players can neutralize elite female serves, control rallies earlier, dictate with fewer shots. This does not invalidate women's achievements, it explains the structural difference. Why rankings become irrelevant across categories. This is where many arguments collapse. People often say that she is number 1, and he is ranked 671. They say rankings should matter, but rankings only exist within the same competitive category. A top junior can be ranked higher than a professional veteran. That does not mean they would win head-to-head. A doubles specialist can outrank a singles player. That does not translate to singles dominance. Rankings measure relative performance within the same field, not absolute ability across different fields. Once you cross categories, rankings lose meaning. The Serena versus Djokovic question everyone knows. This brings us to the most famous hypothetical in tennis history. Could Serena Williams at her absolute peak defeat Novak Djokovic in his prime? It is a question that sparks outrage, loyalty, emotion, and endless debate. But the Kyrgios and Sabalenka match quietly answered it, without words, without drama, without speculation. Because the question was never about greatness, it was about context. Serena Williams is one of the greatest athletes of all time, male or female. Her dominance within women's tennis is historic. But Novak Djokovic competes in an environment where average rally speed is higher, defensive coverage is wider, physical endurance is pushed further, and shot tolerance is extreme. Djokovic does not just beat opponents, he absorbs their best weapons and neutralizes them. At his peak, he handled serves over 220 kilometers per hour, matches that lasted 5 hours, relentless baseline pressure, and physical battles against other elite men. That context matters. Why this conversation feels taboo. The reason this topic creates discomfort isn't because the answer is unclear. It's because the answer challenges emotional narratives. Sports are stories. We connect to athletes. We admire their journeys. We want greatness to feel universal. But competitive fairness requires categories for a reason. Men's and women's tennis aren't separated to protect egos. They are separated to create meaningful competition. When categories blur, the illusion breaks. The real respect is honesty. Ironically, pretending there is no gap is more disrespectful than acknowledging it. Women's tennis deserves respect on its own terms. Strategy, precision, mental resilience, consistency. Not by forcing comparisons that ignore reality. The Kyrgios match didn't expose weakness, it exposed difference. Why this doesn't change women's tennis value. Here's the important part many miss. This conversation does not reduce prize money debates, media coverage arguments, cultural importance, athletic admiration. Those are separate discussions. Acknowledging a physical performance gap doesn't erase achievement. It clarifies it. Women dominate women's tennis. Men dominate men's tennis. That's the structure that allows both to thrive. But there is one more layer most people miss. Because the most interesting question is not whether a male player can beat a female player. The real question is, why does effort level differ so dramatically across the gap? Why can someone playing for fun still compete at this level? And what does that say about talent distribution, physical ceilings, and how we measure greatness in modern sports? That is where this conversation gets even more uncomfortable. The effort illusion, why output looks so unfair. One of the hardest things for fans to accept is what effort actually looks like at the elite level. From the outside, it often appears as if Kyrgios is barely trying. Relaxed body language, joking between points, low visible intensity, minimal celebration. But here is the truth most people miss. Elite male players operate with such a high physical baseline that reduced effort still produces elite-level output. This is not laziness, it is surplus capacity. When someone's physical ceiling is extremely high, they do not need to access all of it to dominate a lower ceiling environment. That is why Kyrgios can skip traditional training blocks, avoid strict routines, still serve faster than most professionals, and still take time away from opponents effortlessly. What looks like playing for fun is actually decades of accumulated physical advantage expressing itself efficiently. Why this feels emotionally wrong to fans. Sports culture teaches us something very specific. Hard work should always beat talent. Discipline should always beat chaos. Preparation should always beat improvisation. So when someone appears to violate those rules and still win, it feels offensive. But elite sport does not reward effort. It rewards output under constraints. Effort is invisible. Output is not. And when two athletes come from different physiological baselines, effort no longer scales equally. That is uncomfortable, but it is not controversial. It is how biology works. Why equal skill is a misleading concept. A common argument sounds like this. If a woman had the same skill level as a man, the match would be close. The problem is that skill cannot be separated from physical execution. In tennis, timing depends on speed. Accuracy depends on reaction time. Technique depends on strength. Consistency depends on endurance. Skill is not an abstract idea floating above the body. Skill is expressed through the body. So when someone says she has better technique, the real question becomes, can that technique be executed at the same speed, under the same pressure, for the same duration? That is where the gap appears, not in intelligence, but in execution limits. Why mixed matches are misleading by design. Exhibition matches between men and women often create false conclusions. They are shortened formats, controlled environments, socially constrained, intentionally non-maximal. Players pull punches. Intensity is adjusted, risk is reduced. Real competition is not polite. Real competition pushes athletes toward their limits, and those limits are not equal across categories. The match between Kyrgios and Sabalenka felt uncomfortable precisely because it did not feel staged. It felt normal. The serve is the most honest weapon in tennis. If you want to understand the gap in one statistic, look at the serve. Not because serving is everything. Serving exposes raw physics. Men's average first serve speeds routinely exceed reaction thresholds, return positioning limits, defensive recovery windows. At that level, rallies shorten, pressure compounds faster, mistakes increase under stress. Women can train technique endlessly, but reaction time has a biological floor. Once that floor is reached, no amount of discipline lowers it further. Why this does not translate the other way around? An important clarification: the gap is not symmetrical. An elite female player entering a men's match faces faster incoming balls, less time to set her feet, reduced margin for error, and constant defensive pressure. An elite male player entering a women's match experiences more time, wider margins, easier court coverage, and lower sustained pressure. That asymmetry explains why cross-category results almost always tilt one way, not because of disrespect, because of mechanics. Why this conversation keeps returning. This topic never disappears because it sits at the intersection of sport, identity, fairness, and admiration. Fans want greatness to be universal. They want skill to transcend categories. But sport does not work that way. Sport works by segmentation, not comparison. Weight classes exist for a reason. Age groups exist for a reason. Gender categories exist for a reason. Not to separate value, but to preserve competition. What this means for legacy debates. Here is where things get interesting. When we talk about greatest of all time, context matters. Dominance within your category is what defines greatness, not hypothetical matchups across categories. Serena Williams does not need to beat male players to validate her legacy. Her legacy exists because she dominated her competitive field, she reshaped standards, and she elevated performance expectations. The same applies to male greats within their own environment. Greatness is relative to context, not absolute across biology. Why Kyrgios is the perfect example. Ironically, Kyrgios is the worst possible messenger for this conversation, and the best example. Because he does not represent discipline, he does not represent structure, He does not represent optimization. Yet the gap still holds. This proves the point more clearly than any controlled experiment ever could. If someone outside peak condition can still cross the gap, then the gap itself must be structural, not situational. The question we should be asking instead. So instead of asking, can Serena beat Novak? The more honest question is, why do we keep wanting categories to collapse? Why are we uncomfortable with difference? Why do we confuse equality of respect with equality of physical output? Those questions say more about US than about the athletes. What this means for the future of tennis. This conversation isn't going away. If anything, it will become louder as exhibition formats increase, social media amplifies hypotheticals, viral moments replace context. The challenge for fans is learning how to appreciate excellence without forced comparison, respect difference without hierarchy, celebrate greatness without distortion. Because when we understand the structure of competition, the sport becomes clearer, not smaller. The Kyrgios match didn't settle a debate. It revealed a misunderstanding about effort, biology, competition, and what fairness in sport actually means. And the next question is even more uncomfortable. If physical ceilings matter this much, how should we really measure greatness across sports? That's a conversation most people aren't ready for, but it's the one we're having next.